This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content.
One of the reasons why I think it's so important to talk about abortion in the context of reproductive justice is that we have to recognize that pregnancy is a moment in time, right? And that, you could have a perfect pregnancy, give birth to a perfect baby, and then bring that baby home to an apartment that has lead paint on the walls, or bring that baby home to a neighborhood that doesn't have clean water, or put that baby into a public school that is completely a part of the school to prison pipeline, right? And so we just talk about abortion as this one moment of, do I stay pregnant or not stay pregnant? And we don't think about the complexity of people's lives.
Hi, I'm Nate.
I'm Gail.
And this is Full Mutuality. Today on the show, I'm very excited to introduce you all to our guest. Her name is Kim Mutcherson. She is professor of law at Rutgers Law School in Camden, New Jersey, and an expert in reproductive justice. Now, there's a whole lot going on there, so we're going to dive into it today. This is going to be a fun conversation. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we dive into the meat of this conversation, I do want to start off with some real casual stuff. What are some of your favorite activities, books, movies, TV shows, all that fun stuff?
Well, one of my favorite activities now is playing the piano, which I did for years and years and years when I was much younger. And then as a teenager, I did the thing that your parents always say you're going to regret, right? I said, I don't want to play anymore. Didn't play for years. And then about a year and a half ago, I was like, you know what? I'm going to start playing the piano again. So I started taking lessons, and it's great. Nice. I love it. Yeah. Nice. So that's my big thing now.
Okay. And that's great because you're on sabbatical now too, so you get the time to dive into that. Those hobbies. I totally relate to that because I do kind of regret I didn't stay with music, but I was in the music world for my entire childhood, and then you can
get back into it.
Yeah, that's true.
Never too late.
Oh, I have a pop culture question for you. So, Gail and I have been watching this show that we love, and I know in a previous conversation you had mentioned you read the books, the Silo series.
Yes.
Okay.
Have you had a chance to check out the TV series?
So I started watching the first season, and I probably watched 2 or 3 episodes.
Okay.
And I liked it. But not enough to stay with it.
Okay.
So I will not read the books because I'm enjoying the TV show.
Yeah.
And usually when
I think
enjoy
they did
the
it
books.
well.
Okay.
Yeah. But because I have the books in my head, it's a little harder to let go of all of that and just focus on what's going on on television.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. I'm kind of similar. I did that with The Lord of the Rings, but the movies were so unique and such a spectacle that I felt like I really had to stick around for that. But yeah, cool. Okay, so here we go. A little bit more background information on you. So what is it that motivated you to pursue law, and then teaching law, and then specifically focusing in on reproductive health?
So I was one of those weird kids who knew what I wanted to do very young. I was 10 when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, and just never shifted from that. And just, organized all of my education around that. So went to college, immediately went to law school after college. And I went to law school to be a public interest lawyer. That was, my plan, best laid plans of mice and men and all that. And so I graduated and I had a public interest fellowship. I started doing work at a place in Manhattan called the HIV Law Project, which I loved and got to do amazing work there. And then about 2 years into that, I thought, I was living in New York. I was living on a public interest lawyer's salary in New York. And I was like, I'm not sure that this is tenable. And so I started looking for adjunct teaching work. Because I thought, I feel like I would be good in a classroom and I could make, a little bit more money. And I ended up applying for a job at NYU in their lawyering program. It was a full-time job, which is not what I was looking for. But I applied for it. I was confident that I wasn't going to get it, and I got it. And next thing I knew, I was teaching a class at NYU. And 2 years, did that for 2 years. And I went on the teaching market, got a tenure track job at Rutgers, and I've been there ever since. So
Wow.
I am very much an accidental law professor. But once I became a law professor, I obviously was still really committed to the things that I was committed to as a public interest lawyer. Um, and I started thinking about, issues of civil rights, issues of women's rights, social justice, racial justice. I feel like I came out of the womb thinking about those things, but it's been, a part of my life really from the beginning. And then through law school is when I really started to focus in on women's rights issues, and then eventually on reproductive justice issues.
Mm-hmm.
What a time in the US to be a part of, reproductive women's justice. Like, maybe
Yes.
it's I know Nate has taken a lot of questions and he's prepared himself for this interview, but I haven't. And I'm butting in. I hope I don't cross out anything you had on your list,
Fine.
Nate. But I was wondering, like, was this shocking for you in the US and like the most recent court? We're going to get into that in more detail, but was it a big shock?
Um, it wasn't, I think before it happened, and before the leak of the opinion, a lot of us who do this work were of the mind that the Supreme Court was going to do what it had been doing for a while, which is every chance that it got chipping away, chipping away, chipping away at Roe. And that's what we were sort of picturing, because the idea that they would completely overrule Roe was so drastic and so, frankly, so obviously political, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing had changed except for the people who sat on the court.
Yeah.
And literally just a couple years before, they had an abortion case where they reaffirmed Roe.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, it was such a bold move to just say, we've got and this is essentially what happened, right? We've got the votes, and so we're going to overrule Roe. And so I think what I was surprised by was that they did it so quickly, and that they were so unconcerned with, issues of legitimacy and issues of how people think about the Supreme Court. And I think what has happened since then is that, the backlash on the court has just been tremendous.
Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't impact them at all, right? They have jobs for life. They're not worried about it. But at least there's a conversation going on that I think is really important, which is a conversation that reminds people that elections matter, not just because of, you know, who ends up on your local school board and who ends up being your governor, but federal elections matter because that's how people end up on these courts.
Mm-hmm.
And those courts matter, and they mean a lot about what you get to do in your life. And people weren't paying enough attention, so
Yeah.
at least people are paying attention now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think let's hit rewind on the story, and then we'll come back to like the present day and the future a little bit. But let's go back to the 70s.
Yeah.
And we have the landmark decision, Roe versus Wade, essentially protecting a woman's right to an abortion in general for
Yeah.
all that entire time from 1973 to 2022. Could you give a little bit of history on that case, and what those protections meant that were afforded to women?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I always start with when I talk about Roe is that, we're in this moment where people are really romanticizing Roe, right? Because we've lost it.
Hmm.
But Roe wasn't that great in a lot of ways. So, it was a case that came out of Texas. Texas had a statute, all bad things start in Texas, I guess. You feel free to cut that out.
Nope.
We actually have one of our good friends who listens to the podcast who's from Texas. She would probably echo your
Okay.
opinion.
All right. I'll accept it then. So, Norma McCorvey, she was a young woman, in her young 20s. She was on her third pregnancy. The previous two pregnancies, she had given birth to children who she then put up for adoption. She gets pregnant a third time, and she says, I don't want to be pregnant. Texas at the time had a statute that said you could not have an abortion unless your life was in danger, and you basically had to go in front of a panel of doctors and convince them that you should be able to have an abortion, which of course she wasn't going to be able to do. And so she became the Roe in Roe versus Wade. And her lawyer, Sarah Weddington, was this, very young feminist lawyer who decided she was going to take this case and amazingly was able to get it all the way up to the Supreme Court. She argued it in the Supreme Court. She also was in her 20s. She was very, very young. And she argued it in front of the Supreme Court and was able to get a decision written by Justice Blackmun that essentially said that the Constitution protects a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. But it was very focused on physicians in a very odd way. Justice Blackmun had a career as a lawyer for the Mayo Clinic at one point, and so people think that that's part of what was going through his head, that he wanted a decision that was sort of rooted in science and medicine, and then that would make it more palatable, I guess, to people. So the decision that the court came up with was, yes, you have this right to abortion, but the state also has an interest in potential life. And their goal was to sort of balance those interests. So they came up with a trimester framework, right? They just sort of mapped it on to what pregnancy looks like. And they said in the first trimester, states cannot regulate at all. It's not a state's business what happens to in a first trimester. In the second trimester, states can regulate, but they can only regulate to protect the health of the pregnant woman. And then in the third trimester, states could go so far as to ban abortion, but any ban on abortion had to have an exception for the life or health of the pregnant woman. And that was basically, the cornerstone of law until about 1992. And in 1992, the court decided a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which came out of Pennsylvania. And in that case, the court said, actually, in Roe, we put too much emphasis on the woman's rights and not enough emphasis on the state's interest in potential life. And so they said, we're going to throw out this whole trimester thing, and we're just going to focus on the line of viability. And that's going to be the dividing line between when you can ban abortion and when you can just regulate abortion. And so still said you have to have an exception for the life or health of the pregnant person. But then in Casey, they said that because the state has an interest in fetal life from the moment that a pregnancy begins, that states can do things to persuade people not to have abortions. States can regulate in much more robust ways. They can, for instance, require biased informed consent. And so some states have informed consent requirements that actually are based on bad science, right? If you have an abortion, you have a greater risk of having breast cancer. Not true, right? So states really, took that freedom and they ran with it. So even before Dobbs happened, a lot of states had really significant restrictions on access to abortion, so much so that there were a number of people in this country living in places where, even though abortion was ostensibly legal, it was not accessible.
I see. Yeah. Ooh. So, yeah, I could totally see how we have gotten to this place where we kind of idolize, romanticize that decision.
Yeah, I had no idea. So much details of that court case that are just not in public sort of conversations.
Yeah.
So talking I guess on the ground, during the years that Roe was the law, what was the landscape like? And I realize, for our audience who's in the US, you all know everything varies so drastically from state to state.
Yes.
If you don't live in the US and you're listening to this podcast, the US is a funny country because there are so many variations from one state to another. If you live in New Jersey, you have a whole different set of rights from somebody who might live in Alabama or Oklahoma.
Right.
Or
Pennsylvania.
Or Pennsylvania, right across the border. Exactly. So what was the landscape like on the ground for women's health, reproductive rights in general? I guess if you give a couple examples from different states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so, if you were in a place like New Jersey, of course you had broad access to abortion. You didn't have any of the sort of bias-informed consent requirements. You didn't have the waiting period requirements. It was just it was a set of circumstances where if you were pregnant and you didn't want to stay pregnant, there were lots of ways for you to terminate that pregnancy and lots of places where you could terminate that pregnancy. And you weren't going to, the law wasn't going to shame you for that choice. And then you contrast that with someplace, I'll use Mississippi because that's where the Dobbs case came from. By the time the Dobbs case came about, there's only one abortion clinic left in Mississippi. Everybody else had ended up closing. States had created all these different rules. They had, admitting privileges requirements. So anybody who was performing abortions had to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, which is totally unnecessary and doesn't protect anybody's health whatsoever. Or they had requirements where abortion clinics had to have the same rules, had to be set up physically, like an ambulatory surgical center. So that was things like, the size of the hallways,
wow.
right? I mean, things that were just ridiculous and totally unnecessary. And again, had nothing to do with safety. And then you, of course, had states that were making it impossible for people to use telemedicine, to have medication abortions early in pregnancy. So there were all these sorts of ways where states, what they really, really wanted was for abortion to be illegal. But because we still had Roe, they couldn't make it illegal, right? So all they could do is layer as much sort of process and procedure on top as possible to make it really difficult for people to access. And I'll give two other examples that I think are really important. So one of the things that happened in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992 is that the court said that states could require young women under the age of 18 to either notify their parents or get consent from their parents before they had an abortion, but that states had to have a judicial bypass option. So you always had to have an option to go to court and to stand in front of some strange judge who you don't know and who doesn't know you, maybe without a lawyer, and make a pitch for why you should be able to have an abortion. So lots of states that required that. And then, of course, for many, many years, Medicaid funds have not been, the federal government has said that Medicaid funds cannot be used for abortions except in a very small sliver of cases. And so what that means is that if you're a poor woman, and Medicaid is how you get your insurance, that Medicaid is not going to pay for you to terminate a pregnancy. And so, people are just scraping together money from as many places as they can. So, the landscape, even before Dobbs, was very patchy, and you already had people who sometimes had to do a lot of travel. And of course, that's just gotten, exponentially worse since Dobbs happened.
It's interesting, because I was thinking about the example that you gave of like a girl who the parental consent is involved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to me it just sort of flies in the face of the spirit of something like HIPAA, for instance. That doesn't that exist to protect people's like medical privacy?
Not for young people.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like there are a lot of states that have carve-outs in their statutes about young people consenting to healthcare. They have carve-outs for, accessing drug treatment, right? That you're able to do that and not tell your parents because that's an important thing and we want you to have access to that. Or getting treatment for, sexually transmitted infections. We don't want you to be scared to talk to your parents, and so we're going to give you a carve-out so you can do that. And you don't have to go to court to ask a judge if you can get treatment for a sexually transmitted infection. You don't have to go to court and ask a judge if you can go to rehab, right? So it's only abortion that was treated differently. And that's been true for a very long time, right? That abortion gets carved out as this very, very different form of healthcare, and one which gets, regulated, to infinity and beyond.
Mm. I think that brings us to a point in this conversation where we can sort of pause from take a quick break from the this part of the conversation and move into a space where we sort of talk about why abortion is such a big deal in the U.S. What is the attitude here, the history behind it and whatnot. And so the world that I come from, that Gail comes from, that a lot of our listeners are all kind of coming to our podcast from, is the world of conservative evangelical Christianity. And one of the things that I think is worth talking about is the history of evangelicalism's relationship with abortion.
And maybe even to paint an even bigger picture of that, like the U.S. versus even other places. I know as a Canadian, when, Roe v. Wade got overturned, the Canadian government spoke up right away to say, in Canada, you guys will still be protected. Like, just sort of an acknowledgement. We don't see things this way. And it was making Canadians nervous. Like, can women's rights be just pulled away? The U.S. is right underneath us. I mean, we're not that different than Americans, are we? And I think there's that sort of a fear. And there are the difference that I noticed from Canada to the U.S. One of the big differences I noticed when I crossed the border is evangelical influence. And I noticed that because I grew up in Canada as an evangelical and we were a minority fringe within the country. And now when I'm over here, I see my former high control religious group having such a big influence. Like, I see it on posters, I see it everywhere, I see it
billboards,
on cars, I see it on, like, it's so surrounding me that I can, and then I start digging into the political sphere. I mean, I just assumed American citizenship, so I've always been politically minded in the sense of caring, but having to really learn a lot more about how American politics works, and just amazed at how evangelicalism has their foothold so deeply in the political landscape of the U.S. And for me,
extraordinary.
You notice it when you're from a country that's not the case, and then you come into a country where that is controlling the landscape of how things are done. So I just want to back it up even past the U.S. because I think Americans might even take for granted how different the U.S. functions maybe than other places because of that influence.
Yeah, there's sort of an assumption that that's normal.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about the moment that we're in is even countries that are deeply religious, like Catholic countries, right? So, Ireland has legalized abortion. Mexico has legalized abortion, right? So you've got these places that have been very, very conservative about abortion access that are actually moving in the exact opposite direction as the United States, which is incredibly frustrating.
Let's pause here for a bit. It's worth noting that the idea that abortion has been a unifying principle evangelicals have consistently stood against is nothing more than a powerful myth. The history of evangelicalism's anti-abortion activism is far more complicated than the religious right would have everyone believe. In fact, their original unifying ideology was racial segregation in schools and universities.
The following information is drawn heavily from a May 2022 article in Politico by Randall Ballmer, the John Phillips Professor of Religion at Dartmouth College and author of Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. We'll link to the full article in today's show notes.
During the 1970s, the IRS made quite a few attempts to rescind the tax-exempt status of private, church-sponsored segregation academies, institutions that admitted only white students, including my own alma mater, Bob Jones University, which would lose tax-exempt status in 1970 and not regain it again until 2017. The battle against what they perceived as government encroachment on their businesses would be an operative principle for many decades to come, but their anger towards racial integration and their defense of segregation was not going to spark the political movement that many evangelical leaders hoped for.
It wasn't until a conservative activist named Paul Weyrich recognized this that evangelicals began to rally around a different cause in the late 1970s. In 1968, the flagship publication of evangelicalism, Christianity Today, organized a conference with the purpose of discussing the morality of abortion. Almost 30 evangelical theologians participated in the debate for several days, issuing a statement that, according to them, allowed for many different approaches to the issue.
Whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed. But about the necessity of it and permissibility for it under certain circumstances, we are in accord, read the statement. Carl F. H. Henry, Christianity Today's editor-in-chief from 1956 to 1968, said that a woman's body is not the domain and property of others. and Harold Lindsell, who succeeded Henry at the magazine from 1968 to 1978, stated, "If there are compelling psychiatric reasons from a Christian point of view, mercy and prudence may favor a therapeutic abortion."
In 1971, delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention, conservative evangelicalism's largest American denomination, passed a resolution that called for the legalization of abortion. They reaffirmed their pro-abortion position in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade was decided, and reaffirmed it again in 1976.
In response to Roe v. Wade, W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas and president of the Southern Baptist Convention from 1968 to 1970, issued this statement. "I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person, and it has always, therefore, seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed." Even one of abortion's greatest enemies, James Dobson, stated in 1973, the same year that Roe v. Wade was decided, that the Bible was silent on the issue of abortion, and an evangelical Christian could certainly believe that a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being.
As support for evangelicalism's crusade against the government for forcing schools to integrate was growing weaker, Paul Weyrich stumbled on the issue that he believed would rally evangelicals to their political cause: abortion. Finally, Jerry Falwell and other leaders of the religious right had the issue that would mobilize their followers and, thankfully for them, divert society's scrutiny away from the racist origins of their movement. It would still take some time for the anti-abortion cause to stick with voters and evangelical-friendly politicians. In a 1980 campaign rally in front of over 10,000 cheering evangelicals, Ronald Reagan didn't even mention abortion a single time during his address, even though it would have been an issue du jour. Evangelical leaders conveniently leave out two important pieces of their history when discussing the topic of abortion. First, that anti-abortion positions didn't become the de facto evangelical stance until nearly 8 years after Roe v. Wade was decided. And second, that the birth of their political movement was based on defending racial segregation in schools, not on fighting for the lives of fetuses, or as they would put it, unborn babies.
Hey there, my name is Allison from Battle Creek, Michigan, and you're listening to Full Mutuality.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica from the Leaving the Village podcast. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for tuning into this show. We're so grateful that you've decided to spend your time with us. Seriously, Dan, Gail, Kathleen, Nate, Scott, and the rest of us here at the Dauntless Media Collective couldn't produce content like the show you're listening to without your support. I'd also like to invite you even further into the conversation. Right now, there are some great discussions happening over in the Dauntless Media Collective Discord server. If you're interested in chatting with other folks who are deconstructing and decolonizing the oppressive traditions they came from, please feel free to hop onto the server. If you don't know what Discord is, it's a place where communities can gather online for chatting on a wide variety of topics. In our Discord server, we have channels devoted to general deconstruction conversations, some meme sharing, therapeutic venting about whatever religious bullshit you're currently dealing with, and even a channel specifically devoted to talking about the latest episode of the podcast you're listening to right now. I hope you'll join us. You can log in directly to the Dauntless server by clicking on the link in the show notes or heading to dauntless.fm and clicking on the link in the top banner. See you there.
It's so fundamentally political, right? And I think that that's such an important thing for people to recognize, that the shift to abortion was in significant ways, and I say this as an outsider and completely, ready to be judged for it, but, it wasn't about these, critical faith principles that people had been living, for centuries.
No,
it was, how do we hang on to expand our political power? And the way you do that is you get your folks to vote for the people who you want to have in office. And what became really clear was that abortion was an issue that people were willing to vote on.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's been really powerful there's been some really interesting political science research, and part of what it has shown is that, people who are, deeply religious, evangelical, Catholic, and, some of these other faiths, that they will vote on abortion. Right, like that is the issue. That
single
is
voter issues.
Or single issue.
Single issue voters.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary, right? Whereas a lot of people on the left, they're voting on, race and gender and immigration and all these other sorts of things. And so it's a really powerful tool when you have this one issue, and particularly when it's an issue where it's so easy to vilify the people who disagree with you.
Yes.
Right? Yep. When you can say the people who disagree with us are people who hate children, who want to kill babies, who hate families, right? I mean, that's really good rhetoric to use, right? And so, I mean, even being able to, I describe it as stealing, right? Stealing the label of pro-life. Right? Yeah. If you're pro-life, then what are the rest of us, right? So it's been really, really powerful how folks on the right and folks in evangelical communities have really rallied around abortion as a way to consolidate political power.
Yeah.
I think the left should have called it, instead of pro-choice, pro-freedom. Then they would have really, it would have really had some good marketing going on there. Because sometimes just the labeling, it just paints a picture of, and that gets people galvanized, right? You care about life, and then you start digging, and you're like, wait a second, the same group of people that are saying they're pro-life are okay with kids getting massacred with guns. If they can protect gun rights, they're okay with, and they don't want free health care. Like you start going through the list, and you're like, life for who, for what? Only the ones the only fetuses that haven't come out of the womb yet.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
And it's a convenient defense because fetuses can't speak for themselves, but the moment someone can speak for themselves, they're no longer, their
rights are not protected anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly.
Right. Now you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and all of that.
2-week-old infant, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Lazy.
I do find it all interesting too, because even in the both the Catholic and evangelical Bible, the idea of life starting at conception, it's not in there. Nowhere in any of those texts can that concept even be close to found. Like maybe they might say, you knit me in my mother's womb before I was even born. You knew, the hairs on my head or whatever. And,
you knew me, you formed me.
If you look contextually, God, in that story, God was talking to Jeremiah, and the character in the Bible, Jeremiah, was feeling, dejected. He felt like he couldn't do what he was called to do. So God, encouraged him by saying, I knew you and I called you to do this thing long before you were ever born. It was a very specific conversation between the God character and this other character, Jeremiah, in the was it Jeremiah or Nehemiah?
I'm not sure.
One of the characters in the Bible.
I definitely don't know.
It is fascinating to look at the texts and to see, I mean, for me anyway, because I grew up with this being the basis of why we believe what we, like evangelicals are very rooted in what does the Bible say. And it was fascinating for me to understand that for Jewish people, most of them believe life begins at first breath. And that's where our Bible comes out of, is the Jewish, Hebrew Bible. It's birthed out of that. So it's interesting to see the evolution of beliefs around when life begins and how evangelicals have sort of turned that into something else for political gain.
Absolutely. And then you also have to sort of think about how not only how people can harness religion, but also how they harness, medicine and science, right? So the fact that we can, that we have tools to hear a heartbeat, right? Or that we have tools to, everybody who's had a baby in this country and who got prenatal care has those ultrasound pictures on their refrigerator, right? And so, we really sort of gave people this way to really visualize what is going on inside of a pregnant person's body, and to convince people, frankly, and the other thing that helps with this is that people are like deeply ignorant about their bodies, right? And so you sort of think about those billboards that, I've seen them in Jersey, but they're, all over the country, where it's like, my heart started beating at, 6 weeks or 7 weeks or something, and they've got like a 6-month-old baby, right? I promise you, that is not what a 6-week fetus,
oh my God,
embryo really, right?
Yeah.
Looks like, right? And so because people are, ignorant of many different things, they are visualizing something that's just not true, right? Particularly with most 90+% of abortions in this country happen in the first trimester, right? And I promise you that what is happening there is not a 6-month-old who's being terminated in utero. That's just not how any of this works.
Yeah.
And when people don't understand that, it helps them to then create this vision of these horrifying things that are happening to babies, and that's just not true.
Right. And then even the conversation around like what the right considers late term abortions. No one who's seeking an abortion like that's under sort of standard circumstances would be getting an abortion that late in the pregnancy. The abortions that are happening that late in a pregnancy are the ones where the mother is already attached to this fetus, is probably thinking through names, probably ready, like they've probably painted a room and bought furniture. Right. And now they're in this incredibly unenviable position of, I have to terminate this pregnancy. Like when you've gotten to that point in a pregnancy, you want that child. Like that's somebody who wants the child. That is not somebody who's trying to use this as birth control or is debating whether or not they want to become a parent. No, this is somebody who's ready and is waiting for this child to be born. So
absolutely. And the other thing that's really ironic is that because of all the new laws that we have and the bans and how difficult it is in so many states now to access abortion, it's actually pushing women later into their pregnancies, right? Because now you've got to travel, you got to get the money together. The clinics are full. So maybe your appointment, instead of being able to get it in a week, you get it in 3 weeks, and every single day counts when you're pregnant, right? And so like the ridiculousness, there's so many things that are ridiculous about, what states are doing now, but certainly one of them is that you're actually pushing people into their second trimester because you're making it harder for people to access abortion.
Yeah. Ugh, it's made everything worse. So I guess now let's fast forward. The year is 2022. The story behind the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. How could you give us a story of that case, and then how that all led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and even some of the political backgrounds and what was going on, the leaks and everything. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So Dobbs was a challenge to a 15-week abortion ban in Mississippi, which under existing precedent was too early, right? Because viability was the line, and viability is around 24 weeks or so. And so Mississippi knew when they passed that law that it was unconstitutional. And the whole goal was to get it up to the Supreme Court. And actually, initially, the goal was to try to get the Supreme Court to start shifting the line earlier in pregnancy, right? Mississippi wasn't even asking the court to overrule Roe. They only shifted their position when Barrett got appointed, right? Because then they knew, they were like, all right, now we've got the votes. We're going all in on this. So that was just a really, that's just hugely political, right?
Yeah.
Like you see that the staffing has changed on the court, and you literally change what you're asking the court to do. So again, last abortion clinic in Mississippi, Jackson Women's Health, they were the plaintiffs there. And we had this, everything about this case was just bonkers, right? So one, you have the court allowing Mississippi to change what it was asking for. Two, you had a leak of an early Supreme Court opinion, which is just, off the charts. Like that is just not a thing that happens. And of course, there was just the New York Times article that came out very recently that was sort of trying to unpeel all the layers of how that happened. And I think, a lot of people have taken the position that it was actually Alito who leaked it, and it was a way to lock people in to his position and in his opinion. Maybe so, maybe not, who knows. But we get the leak. And then, we sit around and, people are thinking, is this really going to be what the opinion looks like? And once I saw the leak, I knew what they were going to do, right? Like I had no hope that they were going to turn that around before the case actually came out. And they didn't even really like clean it up or pretty it up. I mean, it's not a very well-reasoned case on a lot of different levels. So, essentially what the majority of the court said was that, Roe was wrongly decided, that the court never should have decided Roe in the way that it did, that all of these states from, time immemorial had made abortion illegal, that the right to abortion was not something that was, deeply rooted in the history and traditions of the United States, which is, one of the tests that the court will usually use to decide if a right is a fundamental right. And just a lot of, bad history, bad reasoning, all the good stuff. So we got this, majority opinion that basically said, we're getting out of the business of abortion, which of course they haven't, and they won't. We're going to get out of the business of abortion. We're going to give it back to the states, and the states can do what they think is right here. That was the majority, and then we had an interesting concurrence from everybody's good friend, Justice Thomas, who basically said, well, if Roe was wrong, then this whole line of cases that are basically rooted in the idea of privacy or what we call substantive due process, all of those cases are wrong. So, the marriage equality case is wrong, and cases giving us a right to access contraception, those cases are wrong. And
wouldn't Loving versus Virginia and interracial marriages be under that as well?
Oh, but that wasn't wrong. That wasn't wrong.
And well, for him,
no, definitely not. Yeah, that was perfect. It was such an obvious choice not to include that in this list of cases, right? I mean, he's the worst. But so we had the opinion from him that was basically like, it was basically an invitation, really, right? It's basically an invitation to conservative organizations that like to bring all kinds of cases, to say, bring it on, right? We are ready to start getting rid of some of these rights that we don't think should exist in our constitutional order. And I think that's a really important point, that people look at Dobbs and think, wow, this is a really bad thing for abortion. It's not just a bad thing for abortion, right? What they have done here is completely set up a paradigm that allows them to knock down right after right after right going forward, which of course they did, with affirmative action, right? As soon as they got the chance to do that, they did that. And we've got, these other cases that are lining up. So, you have to be really careful about thinking, oh, well, this case is about this issue, and so therefore that's the only thing we have to worry about, because anything that sort of sets up that kind of huge precedent, which is what the court did here, allows them to then, going forward say, well, this is what we did in Dobbs, so we're going to do it again here. And this is what we did in Dobbs, and so we're going to do it again here. And the implications of that are so much broader than abortion.
Yeah. Yeah, because as you were sort of alluding to, Roe had privacy protections embedded in there, and that just like that kind of runs roughshod over some of the what we might consider basic fundamental rights of Americans.
Absolutely.
But now all of that is called into question. I mean, based on our favorite justice's concurrence. But yeah, like,
was Amy Coney Barrett the only woman involved in that in agreement? Was it the rest were all men? Am I correct on that? Yes,
that's right.
So all the women except for Amy Coney Barrett were in disagreement with the men, basically.
That's exactly right.
Surprise,
surprise, surprise.
Yeah, which is basically how all these cases are coming out now, right? They've got their 6-person majority, and they're gonna do as much as they can. with those numbers.
Yeah.
So the future is, so I'll just to throw out another wrinkle into this, right? So we've got the mifepristone case now, right? That's going on now too, which is about access to one of the two medications that are used for medication abortion. Medication abortions can happen up to 10 weeks into pregnancy, and they are incredibly safe. The medications were approved over 20 years ago in this country, and we were even behind because they've been approved in France. And, we know that these things are safe. So people think, oh, the mifepristone case, it's about medication abortion. Well, yes, but it's also about whether the Supreme Court has to give deference to decisions made by federal agencies, right? Because essentially what the court would be saying if it decided that mifepristone needs to come off the market, or that the ways that the FDA has regulated mifepristone are problematic, is saying we know better than the FDA, which is insane, right? Like if I have to make a healthcare decision, or if I have to decide what medication I want, I really would prefer that the FDA is working that out rather than like Justice Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, right? I mean, that just makes no sense whatsoever. So, you can imagine what that looks like if the court says we don't have to defer to the expertise of federal agencies anymore, right? So think about, environmental regulation, all sorts of things that could start to fall by the wayside. So, the world's not so bright.
There's like, just looking at this at a quick glance, it just seems like the Supreme Court is trying to amass as much power as they can.
Oh, yeah.
That's something that seems to be shifting right now.
It's pretty extraordinary to watch. Yeah.
That's frightening.
And it's just a sense of, we can be as out of touch with reality as we want to be, and you can't do anything about it. Right? Like that's what it feels like the Supreme Court is saying to us right now.
Which, like, presidents, senators, congressmen, they all have terms and they all have things you can do if there's problems. If something is problematic, there's ways to hold people accountable. It doesn't seem like on the Supreme.
Not with the Supreme Court.
There's just, and they don't even want accountability now.
That's right. Oh. That's right. Right. I mean, the level of resistance to the idea of having a code of ethics.
Right.
All judges have significant codes of ethics. Why should you all be exempt from that? I mean, it's just, it's infuriating.
It is. So now,
can we go back to Texas for a moment?
Yeah, let's go back to Texas.
Let's go back to Texas.
We were saying all bad things from Texas before. There is a current Texas case that is making headlines. Can you give us some insight onto that situation?
Yeah. So Texas, one of the things that's interesting about what the court did in Dobbs when it threw away Roe is that Roe had, certain flaws. You can't totally ban abortion. And if you do ban abortion at any point, you have to have an exception for the life or health of the pregnant person, right? That was required. That's out the door. So, states ostensibly could have abortion statutes that have no exceptions whatsoever.
So if you're a woman and your life is at risk and you could die, too bad.
Yep. Right. I mean, states could choose to do that. So what Texas has done, and a lot of states already took out their rape and incest exceptions, right? So, and then there was one, I can't remember which state it was, but there was a debate going on in the state legislature. And one of the senators was arguing that, yes, the rape exception, but not the incest exception, which is super sketchy.
Wow.
Let me just
tells
put that
me
on the
something
table.
about that senator.
Sir, keep that to yourself, right? Okay. Deeply, deeply problematic. But so Texas has a statute that is basically a ban pretty much from the beginning of pregnancy. And they have an exception. And the exception is, it's written so poorly, but the exception basically says if there is, a risk to the life of the mother, and then it has sort of two categories, right? So it has one category, which is an actual you will die, basically, if you stay pregnant. And the second category is you will have a substantial impairment. So essentially the same language that's used for the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? A substantial impairment to a major life activity, right? Which, so, we have this exception, and a number of states have these medical exceptions. And the concern of a lot of physicians has been, we don't know when these actually apply, right? Because it's not like doctors were sitting down and saying, okay, let's craft these exceptions in a way that makes sense to us as physicians, right? It's a bunch of like bozos from the state legislature. And so Texas has this exception, and there is this, lovely woman, Kate Cox, who's married and who has a couple of kids at home already. And she became pregnant, and 20 or so weeks into her pregnancy, finds out that the baby has trisomy 18, which is a very bad fetal anomaly, which typically leads either to a stillbirth or a baby who is born and then dies very quickly after being born. Now, if you stay pregnant, there are various kinds of risks that can happen if you stay pregnant, including potentially the risk of death and certainly the risk of impairing her fertility going forward, right? So that they wanted a third baby. This baby is not going to survive. If they wanted to try again, potentially staying pregnant with this baby would keep her from being able to do that. So goes to court because her doctor wasn't willing to perform the abortion, even though the doctor was, very clear this is an abortion that should happen. Because in Texas, if you perform an abortion and you're not within the exception, you lose your medical license. Potentially, you can get, life in prison. Right? There are reasons that people wouldn't want to risk that. So they go to court and they sue and they say, we want an order that allows Kate Cox to have this abortion because it is a necessary abortion for her. In the trial court, so the judge who initially sees the information and hears the testimony from the doctor says, this definitely meets the medical exception. You can have your abortion. She protects the hospital. She protects the doctor. She also has to protect Kate Cox's husband because Texas also has an aiding and abetting law.
Yep. If you drive someone to an abortion clinic, you can be sued. It's crazy when I think about these things.
Yeah, right. I mean, the ways in which they are trying to triangulate to make it as difficult as possible, I would be impressed if it wasn't so horrifying. So she gets the order, and before she can, have the abortion, Ken Paxton, the lovely attorney general from Texas, he says, nobody can perform the abortion. He literally sends a letter to other hospitals in Texas saying, anybody who performs this abortion, I will come after you, basically.
Wow.
God.
I mean, it's just tremendous. And then the Texas Supreme Court gets the case because there's an appeal. Essentially, what the Texas Supreme Court said was, you didn't use the magic words, right? That the testimony from the doctor has to say these specific things that are in the statute. It has to say, in my reasonable medical judgment. And what the doctor said was, in my good faith judgment as a doctor, which is clearly super different from reasonable medical judgment, right? It's got to be totally different. And so basically, the Texas Supreme Court said, it's possible that this is a situation where an exception could apply, but it hasn't been proven yet. And so we're not going to allow this to go forward either. And so she left the state, right? I mean, that was the option that was left to her. And she was in a position where she could do that, where she could actually leave the state. Not everybody's going to be in that position.
Not everybody has the money. Not everybody has the means to take time off work. All the different pieces of that.
Most people who have abortions in this country already have children. So if I have to travel 800 miles to get an abortion, I got to figure out who's going to take care of my kids. I have to take time off of work, and that assumes I have a job where I can just take time off of work. I have to pay for a hotel. I have to pay for travel. If it's a multiple day procedure, I have to stay there, for more than a couple of days. I mean, it's just it's just incredible. And, part of what was so profoundly disturbing when you sort of listen to people like, Ken Paxton and other, pro-life groups from Texas sort of talking about this case, and their position was, here's this woman who wants to kill her baby because the baby has a disability. That's not, to reduce it to something that is just so, and to be so cruel, right? The cruelty of saying to someone, you have a pregnancy that cannot be brought to fruition. You are not going to give birth to a child who can live. So you're 20 weeks pregnant, you're going to stay pregnant for 20 more weeks until that fetus dies inside of your body, right? Which is super, super risky.
Mm-hmm.
Or until the point where you have to either be induced, so you have to labor to produce a dead baby, or you have to have a C-section to give birth to a dead baby, and just completely ignoring the physical and mental anguish that is involved in asking someone to do that. And there are certainly women who make that choice, right? Who find out this is not a viable pregnancy. I'm going to stay pregnant. I had a healthcare provider many years ago. I loved her so much. She's a nurse practitioner, and she was pregnant. And I came to see her when she was probably about halfway through her pregnancy. And I think because she knew what kind of work that I do and the things that I work on, she said, she started telling me that the pregnancy wasn't viable, that there were, all these sorts of issues with the baby, but that she and her husband had decided that she was going to continue the pregnancy, and that was their choice, right?
Wow.
And people make that choice,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very different to be forced into that position. And Ken Paxton and other people feel like it's perfectly fine to force someone into that position, and they're not the ones who have to bear the physical and emotional burden of doing that to someone,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they can stand on their little soapbox, and they can be as self-righteous as they want to be, and completely ignore the fact that women have agency,
Mm-hmm.
that women deserve to be able to make tough choices for themselves and not have those choices made for them, that everybody doesn't have your same religious belief about pregnancy or about the role that women should play in the world. And so, I think that I'm not a particularly religious person. I have deep respect for people who are people of faith. I grew up with a lot of folks. I grew up in a Black church, right? Lots of people around me who are very, very religious, and I respect that. What I don't respect is when you are telling me I have to live your religion,
Right?
And particularly when living your religion puts me at risk in a whole host of different ways.
Mm-hmm. It's so fucking arrogant. And
yes,
just
100%.
I mean, and these are the same people who will constantly talk about humility. We need to be humble before God, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, they come up with all of these bullshit arguments for why they can impose their systems onto us. And
I think the part that gets to me and that I find hardest to swallow is the amount is the role that men are playing in trying to legislate women's bodies. I think whenever I see, it's one thing listening to women debate these topics and discuss them. I may not agree with another woman or a trans man, somebody who actually has their body invested in how these decisions are going to play out. I don't want to exclude trans men from this conversation or non-binary folks who have wombs, but at the same time, having cis men who always seem to have an opinion and what you mentioned about autonomy, I forget which of you was saying that, but of women's autonomy, I think that is ultimately at the crux of men who feel the need to get into these debates with women. Is really there is a sense from these specific men that they have the right to control women overall.
That's right.
Not even, but this is one aspect for them of being able to take control over women and their own autonomy. And so those passionate men just, they trigger something in me because there's an overall thing going on in them that's just about controlling women. Yeah. And it's terrifying.
And, the other thing that I find really problematic is this way of sort of saying, women were made for a purpose, and your purpose is to have babies. And if you die having a baby, well, that's just, you're a martyr, basically. Right? That is, that's the greatest sacrifice that a woman could make, to die, while trying to have a baby. And it's like, maybe I don't want to make that sacrifice, right? maybe I'd rather be alive, you know? And so, so much of this is fundamentally about how a lot of men think about women, right? And think about what we are good for, and what purpose we are meant to serve on this earth. And there's something really powerful about being in a room. And I've been in these rooms, where some guy stands up and says, how could you refuse to live the purpose that God made you for? And I'm like, I bring a lot to the table, right?
Right.
Having babies is just a part of what I am capable of doing,
And who are you to say that that's what God made you for?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What does it say for all the women who cannot have babies, maybe even who want to have babies? I mean, there's already a stigma for women who choose not to have and maybe can have. But what about women who want to and can't? What kind of pressure are you putting on them and their own value? And
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So icky.
Yeah.
Because those inevitably in those circumstances, women are there thinking, well, I can't live up to my purpose. And so what do I exist for? How shitty is that? Get out of those churches, please, ladies. Get out. Just leave them. They're not good. They're not safe for you.
You have more. Your value and worth goes beyond your ability to bring babies into the world.
Always.
Yeah.
Absolutely, always.
Are you an alumnus of an evangelical college or university? Or have you ever wondered what attending or working at one of those schools is like? The Chapel Probation Podcast brings you the stories from students, faculty, and administration who experienced all the racism, the queerphobia, the misogyny, and purity culture weirdness that are kind of the hallmarks of these schools. I'm Scott Okamoto, author of Asian American Apostate, Losing Religion and Finding Myself at an Evangelical University, which tells my story of teaching English at an evangelical school and realizing I didn't believe in God or the Bible anymore. I created Chapel Probation as a complement to my book, but this podcast has become its own community of people who have stories of hurt and pain and stories of triumph during and after their time at evangelical schools. Some of the guests you've probably heard of, but most of them you probably haven't. But all the stories are incredible examples of surviving Christian schools and finding ourselves. You can find Chapel Probation wherever you listen to podcasts, and I hope you'll join us.
So there's this whole conversation about reproductive rights and that landscape. You were the host of another podcast that I produce, and you're the former host of that podcast. And on that podcast,
hasn't it been nominated for a bunch of awards?
Oh, yeah, there are a few awards that it's up for.
To bring that up.
Yeah.
I'll brag for the both of you.
Exactly. But I remember on an episode of that podcast, you were speaking about reproductive justice and differentiating it from this concept of reproductive rights. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. It is one of my very favorite things to do. So reproductive justice is a movement that was started by a group of Black women in the mid-90s. And these were women who, they were activists. They were doing amazing things in their communities across a whole host of issues, including reproductive rights related issues. And they were really frustrated with mainstream reproductive rights organizations, which at the time and, frankly now, tend to be run by white women and often white women with class privilege. And, they really recognized that the mainstream movement was not focused on thinking about fighting for a number of issues that were deeply relevant, particularly to Black women. And so they started this separate movement, and it has 3 tenets to it, which seems simple, but are actually quite complicated. So the first is that every woman has a human right, or I should say every person has a human right to decide if she wants to become pregnant, that she has a human right to decide if she doesn't want to become pregnant or to stay pregnant, and to have the resources to make that decision. And third, and this is the one that I think is so important and goes back to something we were talking about before, that you have the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments, right? And so there are these like sort of three pieces to it. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to talk about abortion in the context of reproductive justice is that we have to recognize that pregnancy is a moment in time, right? And that you could have a perfect pregnancy, give birth to a perfect baby, and then bring that baby home to an apartment that has lead paint on the walls, or bring that baby home to a neighborhood that doesn't have clean water, or put that baby into a public school that is completely a part of the school to prison pipeline, right? And so, when we just talk about abortion as this one moment of do I stay pregnant or not stay pregnant, and we don't think about the complexity of people's lives, right? So, that woman who has an abortion at 25, at 40 might be a patient in an infertility doctor's office, right? Or that woman who chooses not to have that abortion at 25 might have her kids taken away from her at 30 because she doesn't have enough money to keep the heat on in her house. So to just talk about this like small slice of the world and just forget about the fact that once those babies are born and exist in the world, we should still feel a sense of obligation to them and to their families and to their parents, is part of what reproductive justice gives us. And it very specifically and carefully, doesn't tell us the only thing that really matters is your choice, right, to have an abortion, particularly because the context in which people make that choice is always going to have various kinds of constraints, right? Nobody is just sort of, standing in a room by yourself with full agency saying, okay, I'm going to have an abortion, right? It's, okay, I've already got 2 kids at home, or it's, I'm pregnant by someone who is a terrible person. I don't want to be, yoked to this person for the rest of my life because we have a child together. Or this is a fetus that has an anomaly and I don't want to stay pregnant for 40 weeks knowing that, this is not a baby who can survive or that this is a baby who will suffer. Life is really complicated and complex. And so many of the discussions that we have really try to sort of flatten that out, right? And you just can't do that, particularly in this context. And it's really, really frustrating to see people sort of, draw this kind of, either you're going to have the baby or not have the baby, without thinking about how much is involved in making decisions about pregnancy, about parenting, and about, the hopes and dreams that you have for your own life. Right? We're all allowed to have our own sense of who we want to be and how we want to get there and the choices that we want to make. And to decide that there's this group of people in this country for whom that right doesn't exist, is essentially saying that there's a group of people who simply don't deserve the same level of respect as other people do.
Sounds like the pro-justice, am I saying that right? Pro-reproductive justice.
Reproductive justice.
Reproductive justice as opposed to reproductive rights is a very much pro-life on the more expansive version of what that word should 100%. Mean. It's whereas that term is being used for has been very misused. Actual true pro-life involves so many different other people besides just a fetus. It involves the mom, it involves the other siblings, it involves the entire family, the community surrounding.
The community, exactly. Yeah. All of it. And I haven't even, we've had this whole conversation. I haven't even talked about the fact that, this country has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation, right?
Yeah.
The gall, the nerve, the audacity to insist that people stay pregnant in a country that doesn't even care enough about women to keep us alive during our pregnancies, right?
I have definitely thought over this topic as I moved from Canada to the US. The idea of this topic specifically has come to mind in terms of having a baby in the US and what that looks like versus Canada.
Yes.
And then I do have to consider when I think of, reproductive justice movement and white women versus black women, the discrepancy as well. the concerns when I start digging in a little bit, into, huge mortality rate for women. Wait, what? Mm-hmm. How can this gap be this significant and huge?
That's right.
Yeah.
And then understanding how when the movements are led up by people who aren't being affected and how much of a difference that makes to the overall picture as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really, it's the hypocrisy that gets me, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like a state like, like Texas saying, okay, we don't want you to have an abortion, but we also don't want to provide Medicaid for more than a couple of months at postpartum. Right. We could extend it to a full year, but we don't want to do that because we don't want to spend that money. Right. So it's the things that people get away with, right? The rhetoric that they get to use. And then, nobody is challenging them on all these other bits and pieces, all these ways in which they are cruel, to people of color, to poor people, to people who are undocumented. They just get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a quote pulled up that you want to read?
I did. Okay. You saw me Googling this quote. I love this quote on this topic. I think it's just so relevant. It says, "The unborn are a convenient group of people to advocate for. They never make demands of you. They're morally uncomplicated. Unlike the incarcerated or the chronically poor, they don't resent your condescension or complain that you're not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask you to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money, education, or childcare. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that you dislike. They allow you to feel good about yourself without any work at creating or maintaining relationships. And when they are born, you can forget about them because they cease to be the unborn. You can love the unborn and advocate for them without substantially challenging your own wealth, power, or privilege, without reimagining social structures, apologizing, or making reparations to anyone. They are, in short, the perfect people to love if you want to claim to love Jesus but actually dislike people who breathe. Prisoners, immigrants, the sick, the poor, widows, orphans, all groups that are specifically mentioned in the Bible, they all get thrown under the bus for the unborn."
Yes.
That's a Methodist pastor, David Barnhart, but it's one of my favorite from.
I love that quote. Yeah.
That's a great quote.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful. I mean, I think that so many of the people who that quote is directed at wouldn't even get it.
Yeah,
right.
No, they wouldn't.
And that's what's so frustrating about that. But it's so true, right? I mean, there's nobody to push against you when you are the advocate for the unborn, right?
And it sounds so grand, and you can feel like such a hero, and you could be the most morally superior person around by saying, "I am defending the most defenseless."
Yes.
But really what you mean is someone who can't debate anything with you at the same time. So
that's
it's
exactly right.
Very convenient too.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
So, any thoughts on what the future holds for women and others who can become pregnant in the U.S.? Are you hopeful in any way? Do you think all of this is a lost cause, somewhere in between? What are your thoughts?
I've been working really hard on being more of an optimistic person because that is not my steady state.
I want to listen to what you have to say right now.
So that's what I've been really working on. So, there are a few things that make me optimistic. One is that I think that there are a lot of people who have been shaken out of their complacency, particularly young people, right? People to whom it never occurred to them that having an abortion might become something illegal in this country. And I love that has fired up, whole groups of people. And I think that that's valuable. And I think that, we are going to see some really powerful movements. And we've already seen it, right? Some of the ballot measures coming out of states where you would not have expected
Kansas,
it.
that's interesting.
Yeah, right? I mean, I would not have put my money on that, right? So that I think is a really good thing. And I think it bodes well. It bodes well for the future. I do think that that part of what this creates is more pressure on some of those states that have not cared deeply about babies or women post-pregnancy or other pregnant people post-pregnancy. It creates more pressure on them to do better and to be better, right? And we're going to make you stay pregnant, then maybe we should think about, parental leave. Maybe we should think about making sure all the kids in our state are insured.
Sorry, I'm for cutting, and I cannot. Like Canada, you get a year off if you have a baby, and it's not
it's obscene.
A year minus 2 weeks. Come on, let's not go crazy here.
And you can have a year and a half off. The second year they'll cut your pay, but you without them being allowed to replace you, where your position is guaranteed. And this is not job to job. This is not company to company decision, state to state.
This is federally mandated.
This is the government of Canada saying, if you pushed a baby out of you or had it cut out of you, and you've gone through this trauma, your body needs time to recover. You can't be given 6 weeks and then pop yourself back in. You know, and
that's right. And 6 weeks if you're lucky.
If you're lucky,
6 weeks if you're lucky.
It is so horrifying as an outsider to this system to imagine countries exist where this is normal, and a country like the U.S. that assumes to be so, you know, compared to other places, whatever they imagine.
We're the best. We're number one.
I think there's things I've taken for granted as a Canadian now that I'm moving into the U.S. That are shocking and horrifying. And this is one of the top of my list, is just, you just said, maternity leave. I still can't, I'm not even close to being able to wrap my head around how things are done here.
It's appalling. It is appalling, right? And you know, we pat ourselves on the back for having, you know, the Family and Medical Leave Act, which you don't get paid.
No, you can,
right? You can take time off and not get paid.
Who can do that?
How many people can afford to just not get paid for months?
Especially if you're doing
while you're
something,
taking care of a new baby.
Exactly. Especially if you're taking time off to care for a newborn. That's like the most expensive time in life.
Yes.
It's so mind blowing.
Exactly. Yeah, right? I mean, so, you know, I would like to think that this moment creates a lot more pressure on these folks who like to talk this big game to actually put some money where their mouths are. We'll see if that plays itself out. But, you know, there is an opportunity for that to happen. And then, you know, the third thing that is exciting for me is it's really a moment where people are paying a lot more attention to what's happening locally, which I think is so critical. You know, there are states that have amazing state constitutions, you know, state constitutions that specifically provide a right to privacy, state constitutions that actually have an equal rights amendment in them, which we have never been able to get into the federal constitution, right? We don't have an ERA in the federal constitution. I think a lot of people don't realize how much is not in our constitution. Right? You don't have a right to education. You know, there's no equal rights amendment.
But we have guns.
To housing.
We have guns in the
We do have guns. As many guns as you want. Yes. And that, you know, that's who needs parental leave when you have as many guns as you want. Exactly. You know?
Oh man.
So it's really quite stunning. So, you know, I think that people are recognizing that the organizing that needs to be done on a local level, both in terms of elections, you know, if you're, again, I'm right across from Pennsylvania where they elect judges, which by the way is bonkers, but whatever.
That's wild.
You know, then you need to be at every election where judges are being, you know, put on the bench, that those things matter. So again, right, this is a moment where people hopefully are having their eyes opened and are feeling, you know, sort of galvanized, and also frankly recognizing that, you know, the rights that we do have are precarious. And I don't think that a lot of people, right? I mean, there are lots of us who have identities that put us in a position where we're constantly thinking about how precarious our rights are, right? You know, it's only since 2015 that I can get married, right? Because I'm gay, right? You know, and that is a right that the Supreme Court could take away like that if they chose to. So, you know, there's a lot that we have to be vigilant about, that we can't just sort of sit back on our couch and say, okay, well, you know, this is America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Because quite frankly, you know, from the beginning, this country wasn't made for all of us.
Right.
This country has never been about protecting all of us, right? It's been a very narrow band of people who wrote the Constitution. I mean, the thing that I always say is, right, we have such a commitment to this document that was written by people who thought it was okay to own other human beings.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, what?
Yeah.
Right? Please don't talk to me about how important freedom is and this, that, and the other thing, right? So, we live in a country and we live in a time and a place where we just can't be complacent because we've seen what comes from being complacent. We've seen what it has done to our Supreme Court. We've seen, what happens when you don't vote and then a Donald Trump becomes your president, right? We've seen what happens when you don't pay attention to, who's ending up on your local school board. And next thing you've got all these moms for liberty who are like, burn the libraries,
Right. You mentioned complacency. You also mentioned in that, 2015 and the right to get married as a gay person. I mean, I'm looking over Nate's shoulders and the next question was, I'm just going to read it out, but it ties exactly into this. You might have already answered this. I feel like what you were just saying sort of answers this question, but in case you had any other thoughts on it, from 2019 to 2023, you served as the co-dean of Rutgers Law School in Camden. You were the first Black person, the first woman, and the first LGBTQ person to be named a dean at Rutgers Law. So, and the question is, how does this identity inform your work? And I feel like you have already started to talk about that. Do you have anything else to add on to that?
Yeah, the thing that I always say about that, right? So I became the dean in 2019, and the folks on the publicity folks, the comms folks, they were so excited, right? And so they were like, I'm in the newspaper and doing all these interviews and stuff like that. And the thing that I always say about that is that it took longer for my law school to have somebody like me, right, to have a Black person as the dean, than it took for the United States to elect a Black president, right? You don't get to pat yourself on the back for that. You had nothing, right? The person who I am is not because of anything that Rutgers Law School did, right? So, I think it's really important and I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. There are still so many firsts that have not happened in this country.
Yeah.
So many firsts that haven't happened in this country. And there are still so many ways that this country makes it harder for whole swaths of people to be successful. And we're watching things being peeled away, right? So, the Supreme Court's decision and Students for Fair Admissions, that's going to have a real impact on who gets access to higher education. And if you can't get access to higher education, then how do you become the dean of a law school, right?
Right.
So, for me, one of the things that I think is really powerful about growing up as a Black person in America, and I don't want to speak for every Black person, but I think that for a lot of us, we grow up with a fundamental understanding of how deeply flawed this country is, and a fundamental sense that things can get better, and things are better than they have been, but that you can never be complacent, right? You cannot rest on your laurels, that there are lots of ways in which this is not a country that cares about everybody's success.
Yeah.
And I carry that with me, right? It was a huge part of how I thought about being a dean. It was a huge part of how I interacted with students. It was a huge part of how I thought about hiring people, who was going to be in the law school and what kind of opportunities were we going to give to people who wouldn't necessarily always get opportunities, right? And that's a really great position to be in. I mean, there were I could write, pages and pages of things that I did not like about being dean. And it was a really, really tough job. And because I was a first on these multiple levels, I would say that, Rutgers got a 3-fer in me. But because I was a first on so many levels, it makes you hyper visible, right? I mean, people are really paying attention, and, there are some people who really want to see you fail and some people who really want to see you be successful. So there's, this different kind of layer that happens there. But, the best thing I will say about being a first in that way was the number of folks, younger people, who I got to meet in various sorts of settings. And whether it was, I got invited to go to a 3rd grade class at a charter school in Camden. I've now done it 2 or 3 times, and I love it. And the first time I did it, and it's all, Black and brown kids. They're, 9, 8 or 9 years old, and I think about the number of students of color who I have taught over the years who say, so many of our students at Rutgers are first gen law school, first gen college, and students of color who will say to me, I never met a lawyer who was a person of color until I came to law school. And so every time I go and talk to those third graders, I think all of them will be able to say, I have met a lawyer who looks like me, right? And it's so hard to imagine yourself in a role if you've never seen anybody who looks like you who's been doing that work, right? So that, that's it feels like a small thing, but it was really important to me. And whether it was, meeting with third graders or talking to high schoolers or, talking to aspiring law students, it's important to take on these roles, as difficult as they might be, because if you're the first, your job is to prop that door open so that you are not the last. And that's how I always thought about the job.
I love that. Your job is to prop that door open so you're not the last. Yeah.
And I just think of the intensity and magnitude of that. I mean, I could relate only as a woman in a patriarchal church where women were not put in positions of power. And then when they asked me to, I had such a reaction against it because it was like, but you guys don't do this. Are you sure? And I had so much questions. And then the pushback that I received from so many people in my community, because it was a patriarchal church, was immense and intense. And that was just on one level. That was just being a woman in a male-led environment. But then to think, add on another layer of being a Black woman, add on another layer of being a queer woman, and just the pressure, because I felt a lot of pressure, which is one of those three was enough for me. But but and people convinced me to pursue and continue and to pursue that when I was asked to, because initially I almost wanted to say no, and they were like, there are women in your congregation who need to see a woman in this role, and I was like, oh, yeah, that would have been very helpful for me growing up if I had a female youth pastor. I never had one growing up.
Absolutely.
So absolutely. And now being in an affirming church that has a female pastor and how much that has been healing for me to
totally. And even, just recognizing how, the circumstances in which, and, because I've been at the same law school for a long time, and I've seen the succession of white male deans, that came before me, many of whom I think are wonderful people and who I'm very good friends with. And, but, the ways that I responded to certain circumstances that were completely rooted in who I am and my identity, right? My ability to, for instance, to recognize, we're treating this white male faculty member really differently than we typically have treated, faculty members of color or female faculty members, and saying that, right? Saying it out loud. I just want everybody to recognize that we are doing this thing, and that's not how we usually do it.
I'm sure that went over slammingly with people.
Everybody was really glad, when I point out things like that,
they
and it
stand
makes
up
them
and
feel really
cheer.
good about themselves. Yeah. But it's great, it's great to be in a room and to say, I've been here for 20 years, and I'll give you a perfect example. There's this particular way.
I love the examples. Go ahead.
There was this particular way that we used to constitute some of our committees at the law school, and essentially it was, the dean, along with other people in the administration, would create a slate, and you present that slate to the faculty, and the faculty always just signs off on it, right? That was just 100% the way it had functioned, literally for 15, 16 years. And the first time that I did it, somebody raises their hand in the meeting and says, I'm really getting uncomfortable with the way that we do this. I really think that the faculty needs to have more input in how we're putting together these committees and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, okay, because ever since I've been here, this is the way that we've done it. And now you want to change the way that we do it. That's interesting. And just saying it like that, that's interesting. And then having a conversation with people afterwards and saying, I am very clear on what just happened here. I'm very clear on why all of a sudden, there's this urge to change the rules. And I'm not going to pretend like, you just felt that way today, right? There's a reason why suddenly you're uncomfortable with what we have been doing for the last, 20 years. And these are people who I've known for a long time and who, I am friendly with, even if not friends. And so it's really, it was an eye-opening experience. One I'm really glad that I did, and one that I'm really glad is over.
Well, we're excited for you as you embark on this new chapter with
Thank you.
Playing piano and and relaxing and you've it's been a hard-earned sabbatical and excited for you going forward.
Thank you.
Did you have
Thank you so much.
any questions, Nate, to go that you wanted to?
Yeah, so I just a couple wrap-up type questions. Do you have any resources that as far as the various subjects we've talked about today, any resources that people could turn to, whether resources that are like aimed at lay people or even perhaps more academic resources? What do you have for us? And then anything that you share with us, I'll go ahead and put in the show notes as well.
Sure. So for people who are interested in like a sort of basic primer on reproductive justice, there's this really great book that's called Reproductive Justice. And it's written by Loretta Ross, who is one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement, and a professor named Ricky Solinger. And that's a really great resource for people who just want to understand the context more, right? And so it's everything from, the history of forced sterilizations in this country to, welfare reform to prisons, right? And really pulling it all together. So I think that's a really great resource. If you're someone who is interested in what is happening in terms of abortion in this country, one place that's a really great place to get data is from the Guttmacher Institute. They're really sort of the biggest abortion research organization in this country, and they are very reliable. So if that's a piece that you want to know more about, that's a really great place to get that information. And then if you're interested in the litigation that's going on, and I will say again, abortion litigation is going nowhere. We will be seeing these cases for years and years and years to come, and they will be going up to the Supreme Court. So the Center for Reproductive Rights is a really good place to try to keep up with a lot of that litigation that is going on. And then I think that the last recommendation that I will make, which I think is a really good one as well, in terms of reproductive justice, is a book called Killing the Black Body, which was written by Dorothy Roberts. And Dorothy Roberts, she's now a professor at Penn, but Dorothy is like, everybody reads Dorothy, right? Like Dorothy is just the queen of it all. And she wrote this book called Killing the Black Body many, many years ago. And it's this really great collection that helps people understand the many ways in which Black women in particular in this country have really been abused and denigrated, often through legal channels. So, I think that there are lots of different spaces for people to start to understand the complexity of some of the issues that are reproductive justice issues. And I think a lot of that understanding has to begin with a really stark acceptance of this country's very deeply tragic history.
Yeah.
Super important 100%. To understanding the context.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And finally, where can people find you online if they want to follow you, if they want to get a sense for, do you take pictures of food and post it to social media? Like what?
So I have abandoned Twitter. I still have my account open. I deactivated it and then I reactivated it because I needed to DM someone.
Oh.
But I'm not posting there anymore because I'm scared of Twitter at this point. So I'm on Blue Sky.
Okay.
And I'm at Professor Mutch, MUTCH, on Blue Sky. And that's really, and LinkedIn, obviously, but LinkedIn is not particularly interesting. But I'm trying to get back into the swing of things on Blue Sky.
Okay.
So that's the place to find me.
I know you said that was your final question, Nate, but I have one. Knowing that you're from Camden, New Jersey, and I'm talking to two people here that are from New Jersey.
She's gonna make us fight.
This is particular.
Yes, there is a Central Jersey.
I agree on. I do agree with that.
That wasn't the question I was going to go with. We mentioned food and we North and South Jersey question. So this is only people who are not from New Jersey need to know. New Jersey people have arguments about unimportant things. So we've been talking about very important things through this whole podcast. I figured we'd finish on a very unimportant note, but to Jerseyans, these are critical questions. So what is that sandwich called that you guys eat in New Jersey? Is it called pork roll or is it called Taylor ham? That's what I want to know. Nate really has a lot of love for
We're
you.
going to count to 3 and we're both going to say it at the same time.
All right.
Okay.
Ready?
All right.
1, 2, 3.
Taylor ham.
Yeah, of course.
And here's why. You see,
Nate,
this.
stop it.
Do you see the zip code on this shirt, right?
North Jersey here, South Jersey here, so that's why you have the difference.
Here's my diplomatic take on it. All right.
I've never heard
so
this yet.
it's you've heard me. Yeah, you've never heard me put it as a diplomatic take, but so it's like the difference between Kleenex and tissues.
No, now you're trying to make your side right. That's not a diplomatic take, Nate.
No. This isn't what. Listen. The difference between Kleenex and tissues, right? I have heard plenty of people say tissues. I say that. Can you grab me a tissue? But I ordinarily say Kleenex, right? That's
no matter what brand it is.
No matter what brand it is. I get it. Okay.
Right.
But to me,
which is wrong. I mean, that's just fact.
When I hear someone say pork roll, the only thing that runs through my mind is not whether they are right or wrong. It is that gives me a sense of where you're from. That's
totally fair.
So if you're listening to this and you're not from New Jersey and you're ever around people from New Jersey and you want to detract to another topic entirely and get two New Jersey people to argue with each other, this is a go-to. Just letting you all know, this is what.
Even two people from New Jersey who agree with each other
on a lot of things,
they will become very passionate about this. Even two people who believe it's the same thing, pork roll or Taylor ham, they will passionatally defend their side.
Nate was showing me a video on this yesterday, and I was like, oh, so passionate about this all the time, Nate. It's I'm going to have to get used to this in New Jersey.
Yeah. You know what? There's so many terrible things in the world.
Right.
If we can fight about like total bullshit.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It's nice to argue over something unimportant. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, especially when you're right and the other person's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
It's perfect.
Exactly. When I'm right and you're wrong.
This has been a lot of fun and an important topic. It's been, we like to say, fun conversations and often can be uncomfortable or challenging conversations.
Absolutely.
And that's where we like to land, is to give people some stuff to chew on. So thank you so much for being willing to spend this time with us and to impart all your knowledge, your insight onto this. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me. This was super fun.
Real quick before we sign off, since we mentioned their award nomination, I want to congratulate today's guest, Kim Mutcherson, the former co-host of the Power of Attorney podcast, and our own Nate Nakow, who's also the producer of that podcast, as well as former co-host Rose Cuizon-Villazor, current host Joanna Bond, and executive producer Shanita Carter, on winning the Silver Anthem Award in the category of diversity, equity, and inclusion in audio podcast and the category of media awareness. Great job, folks.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast. We're so glad you decided to join us today.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Cast, Spotify, and pretty much every other podcast app. Just search for Full Mutuality on your app of choice or visit our website, fullmutuality.com, for links to all the apps you can subscribe to us on.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, we'd love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on our website. A quick review is one of the best ways you can support us.
Speaking of support, you can also partner with us on Patreon. For just $5 a month, you'll be helping us produce this podcast, and you'll get access to other content such as exclusive episodes, access to occasional live stream recording sessions, and more. Just head over to patreon.com/fullmutuality to sign up.
Thank you again for hanging out with us today, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast.
This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content.